Okay. Well, thank you all. This is going to be really fun, I hope, for you, as it has been for me. I'm really glad to be back. We did a wonderful 5-week session on the Book of Common Prayer while I was still in Florida. I'm now only 2 miles from the church, not 2,200 miles from the church. But because of the situation we find ourselves in, this class will need to be a remote class. And I'm really thankful to Ruth Ann for the opportunity to do this. I'm calling this 5-part series A Popular History of the Episcopal Church. I think we saw in the class on the prayer book how much politics and culture affects theology and liturgy in the shaping of the church in England. And that's also the case for the church in the United States, as we're looking at the founding of the Episcopal Church right after the end of the American Revolution. So what we're going to do in these 5 sessions, we're going to be covering 4 different time periods. Today, we're going to look at the Revolution until the Civil War. Next week, we'll look at the Civil War until the Great Depression. Then in our 3rd week, we'll cover the 1930s through the 1970s and the 1976 until the present period. Our 4th week is going to be a little different. I'm going to choose 5 historical church buildings around the country and then talk about our cultural history in light of those particular church structures. And then in that last session, I'm going to try to do a synthesizing lecture that maybe gives us some roadmaps of where the Episcopal Church will be going in popular society and culture in the years to come. So I think it'll be fun. And as we always do in these, we move pretty fast and try to make it fun. I'll be naming several resources along the way, but again, and I encourage you to do this, a lot of this just comes out of going down the Wikipedia wormhole, choosing one topic, seeing where that topic takes you, going to another topic, and you uncover some real gems as you do it that way. At the end, we'll always leave some time for questions and your own comments. So here we go. Buckle up. Once again, it's going to be a bumpy ride. Well, I think you can understand that the Revolutionary War took a heavy toll on the Anglican churches in the American colonies. The Church of England had half as many clergy on the last day of the Revolutionary War as it had on the first day of the war. Trinity Church Wall Street, which was the most prominent congregation in the Northeast and notoriously supportive of the King of England, saw its building burnt to the ground in September of 1776. Its rector at that time later decamped to Nova Scotia, as did many of the clergy who had to leave the country, and he became the first Anglican bishop in the Church of England in Canada. Well, the Northeast was primarily Tories and Loyalists, but the church in the South actually provided many patriots. And they took as their example the church in Scotland, who had chosen to remain an Anglican church, but were no longer praying or recognizing the King of England as the head of the church. And so there were many more patriots coming out of Virginia, the Carolinas, including Patrick Henry. It was at St. John's Church in Richmond when he was giving a sermon as a very young man that he used his famous phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death." So the American Revolution happens. The Church of England is obviously going to be disestablished in the United States. So what did it look like when the smoke finally cleared? Well, the Episcopal Church barely got off the ground. In the period from 1783 until 1800, the biggest issue facing our church was not theology or liturgy, it was survival. And it was only through a great effort that 3 men were consecrated bishop, and then finally a 4th and 5th. And without that effort, our church would have been organized along the lines of the Presbyterian Church and would have taken an entirely different history. But by 1800, we had established the General Convention as the organizing means of the church. We had adopted an American Book of Common Prayer. We had set up 7 dioceses, and we finally had enough bishops to make new bishops for when we needed them. So the issue of survival had finally been met, and now we could start to look at what would become of this new Episcopal Church in the religious dialogue that was taking place in America. So what was going on in the United States at that time? Well, the sensibilities of the Episcopal Church stood in great contrast to the prevalent Christian movements of the day in the late 1700s and 1800s. Now, in the wider sphere of Christianity in America at that time, there was hardly any participation whatsoever by Catholics. It was only with the first waves of immigration that the Catholic Church began to grow. And so what was the religious dialogue was among many different Protestant groups. And there had been what had been called the Great Awakening in the mid-1700s. You'll remember Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, dangling a spider over the flame. George Whitefield, who had been sent by John Wesley. John and Charles Wesley themselves came to this country. And there became this religious revival of great enthusiasm and spirit. And the idea that it wasn't your water baptism that was important, it was your conversion experience that was really what made you a candidate for salvation. So this set up a conflict between what were called the Old Light churches, which included conservative Congregationalists and Presbyterians, as well as Episcopalians, and the New Light churches that included the Baptists and the Methodists and certain segments of the Congregational and Presbyterian churches. So this mixed dialogue was going on, and probably the biggest show in town at this time were the Methodists. John Wesley, near the end of his life, he had been a lifelong Anglican priest. He chose to ordain his own ministers. And that was a big break with what we call the apostolic succession, that these were now ministers who would not be recognized within the Church of England, and yet they acted as ordained ministers in the United States. And so Methodism was spreading like wildfire, not just in the 13 original states, but in what at that time was called the West, which was the region that stretched all the way to the Mississippi River. We were part of a very rational religion. The Episcopal Church, Anglicanism in the colonies, from its start could be said to be a denomination that worshiped reason. And the roots for this came because of the creation of a group called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel by Thomas Bray, who's remembered in the Diocese of Maryland with several buildings named after him. He set up this society, raised funds for the training of clergy to be sent to the United States, and during the 1700s, 300 new clergy were ordained and sent to serve the church in the United States. Well, they were coming from the Church of England at the time. And if you'll remember from our prayer book class, after the restoration of King Charles II in 1662, the Anglican Church was no longer tied to scripture as it had been in the past because of the bloody revolution that had taken place. And this was the rise of the age of reason and the enlightenment. And so those became the tenets of Christianity as Anglicanism came to the United States. Between 1662, when Charles II became the king, and 1770, we went from 45 Anglican churches in the colonies to 400. And almost all of those had been staffed and supplied and trained by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in a very moderate, rational style of Christianity. And you could see this in the architecture of the churches that were built during this period. If you go into South Carolina and North Carolina, probably in Maryland too, and you see church buildings, there aren't that many of them, but there certainly are a few that were built in the 1700s. They're built in the neoclassical style. They actually have Greek pillars on the front. When you walk into the church, there's a flat ceiling, and the windows aren't stained glass. They're like the window behind Ruth Ann. They were clean, bright glass to let the light in. And so this neoclassical style of architecture, again, is a way to worship reason. It stands for the power of the spoken word. And you can see this in some of our oldest churches around the country. As Robert Pritchard, who wrote this wonderful book on church history, and that'll be one of the ones I recommend as we go along, he talked about an architect named James Gibbs, who became very famous in England, because this was going on in England too. And he said that Gibbs constructed churches with columns reminiscent of classical Roman and Greek designs. The resultant pattern was a marriage of Christianity and classical thought, the architectural incarnation of the hopes of Christians of the moderate enlightenment. So that's how he would have described Anglicanism in America, the moderate enlightenment. Or you could have called it the rational orthodoxy. And as part of that, Anglicans and then the early Episcopal Church put a high value on education. Thomas Gray started many schools, started schools among Native Americans, among Blacks, started schools because there weren't public schools at that time, except in Massachusetts, for children. But also right after the Revolution, in that first 20 or 30 years, the Episcopal Church moved to create seminaries, theological schools for the training of their clergy. 3 seminaries were built in the 1820s. General Seminary in New York City in 1822, Virginia Theological School in Alexandria in 1823, and then out on the Western Plain, Bexley Hall, the theological department of Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio, which is about 30 miles from where I grew up. So I want to look at General in Virginia because they're perfect teaching institutions to showcase the 2 liturgical and theological parties that had emerged by the 1820s in the Episcopal Church. And these parties really held sway for the next 100 years. General was high church, and Virginia was low church. Okay, in our past classes, we've used those terms. High church proponents saw our Anglican tradition as distinct from Protestant expression and felt more affinity to a Catholic understanding, put a major emphasis on apostolic succession and right order in the liturgy and in the organization of the church. And that was evidenced in the rule of bishops. So that's the high church movement at this time. The liturgy and ceremony was a very important part of the church life. Now, if you wanted to find someone who really stood for that tradition, probably our best example from that period was John Henry Hobart, for whom Hobart College was named. Okay, John Henry Hobart was first an assistant rector and then became rector of Trinity Episcopal Church on Wall Street. Then he became the Bishop of New York, and he was a leading force among the high churchmen, and he was an amazing organizer. By the time of his death, he had organized 2 new dioceses, and he had ordained 195 clergy. So over a quarter of all the priests in the United States were canonically resident in the Diocese of New York. Okay, he's the rector of Trinity and the Bishop of New York. 7 of his assistants at Trinity Parish became bishops over the coming years. And as they were elected bishop, they would take his high church tenets with him to these other dioceses, especially missionary dioceses. And so that is why the upper Midwest of the United States has always had a very strong high church tradition because of bishops that were influenced by John Henry Hobart. Okay, so that's high church on one side. Now, low churchmen saw themselves as simply part of the Protestant Reformation. They were into ecumenical dialogue and work together. And many of them even questioned the theological basis for bishops. Some of them would have wished back when we organized the church that we would have become a Presbyterian-style church. These people were evangelicals who were much more influenced by the Second Great Awakening, which came around in the 1800s. And this is when revivals really swept across the land. So these folks, low churchmen, saw the need for more personal piety and this idea of a second baptism of conversion. So this party really took on steam as churches developed around Washington, D.C. And it was a group of young clergy there in the second decade of the 19th century that really organized this low church expression and led to the creation of Virginia Seminary as a counterbalance to General Seminary. Just for holding up one leader of this group, William Wilmer, had really laid out the low church understanding in a book he called the Episcopal Manual in 1815. Within 5 years, he was elected the president of the House of Deputies at the General Convention and served in that role for several terms. And so you already are seeing now in the House of Bishops a predominance of high church people, and in the House of Deputies, a much stronger party of the low church. Now, he needs allies in the House of Bishops in order to carry on this low church dialogue, and he found it in a man named Alexander Griswold. Okay, Alexander Griswold was the bishop of what at that time was called the Eastern Diocese, which included all of the states of New England, except for Connecticut and Massachusetts. Now, Bishop Griswold had been a high churchman, and then in 1811 in Rhode Island, a revival came to town, and he was slain in the spirit and had an ecstatic experience and converted to the low church understanding of the Anglican tradition. So these divisions that started at this time really held for a long time in the life of the church, and you can see it in the histories of particular dioceses. The diocese was the primary unit of the church because of this division and distinction. So the dioceses of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, they adhered to those high church principles. And then dioceses like Virginia and Ohio became fiercely low church. Now, I experienced this myself. I was ordained in the Diocese of Southern Ohio, which was part of the Diocese of Ohio before they split off. And in seminary, my diocese was affectionately referred to as a coat and tie diocese. What that meant was that our clergy didn't wear clerical collars. They wore coat and ties. They were referred to as Mr. rather than Father. And communion would only be held quarterly or maybe monthly, but certainly not every week. So that's just one example of that low church tradition continuing all the way into the 1960s and 1970s. Well, because of these struggles and divisions, the first nationwide organization for our church was not the Episcopal Church, but it was the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, because that was one thing high churchmen and low churchmen could agree on, that we should be involved in missions and outreach. And so we were organized as the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society in 1821, and that is still the official name of our church. Our incorporated entity is not the Episcopal Church, it's the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. So these are tensions that are really growing. I mean, and it's really getting ugly in certain places, and they grew all through the 1830s. And it was during the 1830s that the Oxford movement, the Tractarian movement, which was very important in England, Cardinal Newman, Pusey, they had really rediscovered ancient Catholic roots for Anglican worship and polity, and they wrote a set of tracts that really turned the church upside down. Well, that discussion that the Oxford movement started came across the pond and really enlivened the conflict and dialogue, because these were newly discovered and well-researched principles of what it meant to be high church. This spoke to a new hunger in many people within our church, but really in America. Up until this time, because of our age of reason and our rational thought, Our primary offering to people seeking Christianity was clear, rational presentation of doctrine. Well, in the 1830s and 1840s, if you'll remember in literature, we're moving into a Romantic period. And that literature infected and affected theology. And so folks began to seek and long for mystery and beauty and a sense of transcendence and permanence. And so that gave fuel to the people moving more from a Protestant expression to a high church expression. And again, you can see this change literally written in stone. You'll remember that Trinity Church had been burnt to the ground in 1776. They built a second church building, but then in 1846, they took down their simple neoclassical building and they built the building that is there today at the end of Wall Street that you see in all the famous pictures, with that beautiful high steeple and that neo-Gothic style. So this neo-Gothic style is now an architectural style that calls you into transcendence when you walk through the doors. Beautiful stained glass, side altars, very prominent high altar. That's what came with the neo-Gothic structure, and really neo-Gothic became the primary architectural design for Anglican and Episcopal churches across the country. Our very own mother church in Seattle, that ancient building, Trinity Church, built in 1906. Can you believe how old a church building that is? 1906 is a perfect example of neo-Gothic architecture. And it was built during the time when this idea of churchmanship had really begun to spread. Okay, so here you are. You've got all these low churchmen that are terribly upset about these changes, and these high churchmen that feel like they've gotten a new lease on life because of the Oxford movement. And it all came to a head at the General Convention in 1844. The low churchmen, with our old friend Wilmer, who was the head of the House of Deputies, brought a resolution to the floor to condemn the influences of Roman Catholicism and the Oxford movement. In the House of Bishops, this effort was led by Bishop McIlvaine of Ohio, a very low church diocese. He had actually written a diatribe against high church in 1841 in a book called The Oxford Divinity. So here we are, at the height of the session. The low church proponents put on the floor of the convention a resolution that stated, listen to this, the minds of many of the members of this church are sorely grieved and perplexed by the alleged introduction among them of serious errors in doctrine and practice, having their origin in certain writings emanating chiefly from members of the University of Oxford, and therefore ask the House of Bishops to take such order thereon as the nature and magnitude of the evil alluded to may seem to them to require. All right, so that's moved on the floor of the House of Deputies in the General Convention, and it lost in a very, very close vote. Because it lost in that house, it didn't have to be debated by the House of Bishops. So the 1844 convention chose not to take a stand or to rule on the validity of the influences of the Oxford movement. So that was a key moment in this dialogue between high and low church. Well, a General Convention resolution is never the end of any argument. And so what happens now is there becomes a couple of new arenas for this discussion. One of them becomes the election of bishops. In nearly every bishop election following 1844, there's a high church candidate and a low church candidate, and the diocese electing their bishop sort of puts a stamp on which direction they're going to take. The other arena for this became another expansion of seminaries and theological schools. Nashotah House in Wisconsin in 1841, Berkeley Divinity School in New Haven in 1854, Seabury in Chicago in 1860 were all founded as high church seminaries. Which was founded in 1862 because low churchmen from the north could no longer go to Virginia because of the Civil War, as well as the Episcopal Theological School in Boston in 1867 were created as low church seminaries. So by having these 7 seminaries now clearly delineated as either high church or low church, and by that time, most clergy were attending seminary rather than what was called reading for orders, where you sort of studied under a priest or a bishop. So we're beginning to see this conflict between high and low church spread across the country as we added dioceses in California, across the Midwest, and even the first churches, Trinity Church here in Seattle. Okay, well, I called this a popular history of the Episcopal Church intentionally so that we could sort of delve into the dark underbelly of church life, as well as sort of the facts and history of our church. And I dug up a juicy one for you to go along with this high and low church dialogue that we've been talking about. Now, if you've lived through our church's debates about women in ordination and gays and the prayer book, you know things can get very personal. And that was really the case leading up to the General Convention of 1844. Because in addition to the dialogue about the Oxford movement, there was another great issue, really a scandal. And that was at the 1844 General Convention, they launched a trial of Bishop Underdunk of New York. And I found his story in an obscure article on his family's history. Now, Bishop Underdunk, okay, he was a true prince of the church. He was born into a wealthy, established New York family, the Underdunks as well as the Treadwells. And he was taken personally under the wing of Bishop Hobart, who studied him for orders and ordained him at 23 years old, made him an assistant at Trinity, and right when they founded General Seminary, made him a professor there. So already by his mid-20s, he's a leading scholar of the high church movement. Well, Hobart died suddenly in 1830, and Underdunk was the natural candidate to be his successor and was elected the Bishop of New York at a pretty young age. Well, he's a high churchman. He loves the Oxford movement, but part of the Oxford movement in England was also a true interest in the working poor and the destitute. And so one of his first actions after becoming bishop in 1830 was to create in 1831 the Protestant Episcopal City Mission. So he was a proponent of the poor, but he was also the chaplain to the very, very wealthy. Not just in New York, but across the country. He officiated at the wedding of President Tyler and his fiancée, Miss Julia Gardner of the Gardners of Boston. Okay, so here's this society man. He's standing up for the high church movement. He's inspired by the Oxford movement. And he goes to the 1841 General Convention. Our convention meets once every 3 years. And he gives this impassioned speech where he advocated, and this is a quote from his talk, "I advocate a return to Christ, to the principles, faith, and order of his one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church." With that sermon, he became the target for high churchmanship and as a proponent of the Oxford movement. It really came to a head for him in 1843. Just like he had been chosen and held up by Bishop Hobart, he had anointed a seminarian named Arthur Carey, who he would see succeeding him as he went along. Well, Arthur Carey was basically a Roman Catholic. And at his ordination, the rector of St. Peter's, which is down in Chelsea, and St. Mark's, which is in the Bowery, showed up at the ordination and tried to interrupt the ceremony to place a protest against this Arthur Carey being ordained. But finally, on July 2nd, 1843, Arthur Carey was ordained. Well, this really ticked off the Low Churchmen, particularly a guy named James Richmond, who was a rector in Rhode Island, which was a very low church diocese. He started circulating unpleasant rumors about our bishop, that our bishop was a drinker who had on more than one occasion acted indecently with women. And so he was known, Bishop Underdunk was known to be this big gregarious sort of coarse gentleman. And it wasn't that long a hop to go from that to accusations, to which James Richmond declared, I am going to Philadelphia at the General Convention to overthrow the Bishop of New York. And so Richmond went with affidavits from 4 women and presented them at the General Convention. Well, 3 low church bishops, William Meade of Virginia, Stephen Elliott of Georgia, and James Otey, brought these accusations against the bishop and accused him of acts of immorality and indecency. The women involved, who were these virtuous and respectable ladies, submitted their testimony that the bishop had touched them inappropriately. His accusers stated, now what's so terrible about this is at his trial, the bishops decided they were going to put all this in the public record. This wasn't a private affair. This was getting published as the trial was going on. And his accusers stated that he thrust his hand into her bosom and impurely and unchastely passed his hand down along the person and the legs of said lady. And during an incident that happened in 1842, he passed his hand in the most indecent manner down her body so that nothing but the end of her corset bone prevented his hand from being pressed upon the private parts of her body. Okay, this is racy stuff even today, but you can imagine in New York City, the Bishop of New York, who had performed the president's wedding, being put on trial for these kind of things. So I found this clip from the New York Daily Herald on January 1st, 1845. The trial of Bishop Underdunk now supersedes everything else. Even dandies stop on Broadway to say, anything new from the St. John trial today? And among our fashionable ladies, how is our dear man coming on, or what will be done with that old sinner? Well, it was a trial, 17 bishops, 11 bishops voted to convict him. He refused to resign because he didn't want to admit that this was going on. So instead, they paid him his full salary from 1845 until 1861 when he died. And his funeral at Trinity Church in 1861 was one of the biggest funerals that were ever hosted at that church. And if you go there, it's fun to go to Trinity and walk in the graveyard. And his sarcophagus is there at Trinity in his bishop's mitre. And under his foot, he's stamping down a serpent, and written on the serpent is the word scandal. So, well, that's just one example of what it means to be an incarnational church, that we not just live in our heads, but we live in our bodies, and our arguments are not always these rational discussions, but can get pretty personal. So I think I'll leave it there for today. We've gone on long enough. Next week, we're going to cover the Gilded Age, when really the Episcopal Church came to be known as the Republican Party at prayer. But we'll also look at how important the Episcopal Church was in the creation of institutions like art museums and universities and many other areas of the arts. So I think I'm going to stop there. You can unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment or anything you want to bring up. And thanks for your patience on what went on a little longer than I wanted it to.
Thank you. This is great. I can hardly wait till next week. This is all just very, very interesting history. Thank you.
I know about it. Yeah. Peter, this kind of goes back almost to the beginning of the thing, but the number of bishops, how many bishops or how many clergy does it take to create the bishop? Because I know they had to go back to England for time for that.
There was a great debate at that time, but it becomes standard within the Roman Catholic Church early on, and then within the Anglican Church, that there need to be 3 bishops, each of whom had been ordained in the apostolic succession, which in our idea is that St. Peter ordained a bishop, then those bishops ordained bishops going all the way back to St. Peter.
Okay.
And so as we began to try to have an Episcopal Church in the United States, we needed 3 bishops. Well, when the Revolution came to an end, the Church of England still required any priest to pledge allegiance to the King of England as the head of the church.
Oh, right.
So Samuel Seabury went to Scotland and got ordained by what were called the non-juring bishops. They were people who, after the William and Mary came on the crown, they no longer pledged allegiance to the king. And so Samuel Seabury got ordained in Scotland, and that's why our prayer book has a lot of Scottish influences. Well, Parliament, about 4 years after the Revolution, around 1787, changed the laws so that we could have an Episcopal Church in the United States without our clergy pledging allegiance to the king. And so William White, who was really, he was our most important patriot priest, and really, I think, the founder of the Episcopal Church. He went and got ordained, and then a guy named Provost got ordained. And then they got a man in Virginia named James Madison. They were cousins with the president. And those 3 went to England to get ordained because they were worried that there might be question about the succession if they used Samuel Seabury.
Oh.
So once we had 4 bishops, 1 ordained by the Scots and 3 ordained regularly in the Church of England, we could then begin to create our own bishops. And so then the ordinations of bishops began, I think 1797. I'd have to check exactly when. But that's why it took us some real wrangling to get ourselves established as an Episcopal Church, which means bishop, as opposed to a Presbyterian church, which means priest or minister.
Thank you.
So Michael, our man Thomas Bray was very active in Maryland.
Yeah, of course, Maryland started out as one larger diocese, and then the Eastern Shore on the eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay split off from the Diocese of Maryland and became the Diocese of Easton.
Right.
And historically, because it was so far away from Baltimore, where the seat of the bishop was, the Diocese of Easton developed a long tradition of anti-bishop, like a very, very strong sense of independence of each parish, because they so seldom saw a bishop. They just said, this is somebody coming in just to stir things up. Just stay home, thank you very much, and we'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. Would you have called that diocese a low church diocese then, or was their churchmanship mixed?
I don't know historically, right? I think it's probably still very, probably combination of both, depending on where you are. There are still some, but now I think it's generally more on the side of high rather than low.
Well, and really, since we adopted the prayer book in '79, the high-low distinction has really, really changed.
Right, right.
I mean, in Seattle, we formed an Anglo-Catholic parish called St. Paul's, which is down in Queen Anne, and that still is very much what we would call our highest church. St. Clement's up in Mount Baker is a very high church. Trinity at its time was considered a high church, even though up against some of the others it wouldn't be. The church I serve, St. Andrew's Church, its founding pastor was as low as you can go and was very, very Protestant. And so St. Andrew's Church had a very, very low church tradition. So there's still the remnants of those, but really with the liturgical renewal movement in the 1920s, 30s, 40s that resulted in our prayer book, as well as what we'll study next week. Next week, we'll study the new category called broad church. And broad church became an expression that tried to use parts of both different theologies of high and low, but was primarily focused on what the church was doing out in the world rather than what we were doing within our four walls. So next week, we'll spend a fair amount of time on what's called the broad church movement. And really since, the new prayer book, any congregation, you could go to almost any of our churches and they probably have a thurible ready to load up with incense. Many of them would only swing it on Christmas Eve and Easter. Others of them are swinging it every week. I don't know how often we have incense at Epiphany. Well, with our new liturgy at 11 o'clock, we had it every single week. So these are all sort of examples of what we're talking about when we talk about high church versus low church.
Interesting.
Too much incense.
Yes,
That's why you got to go at 8:45 now.
Far too much incense.
Well, I think we should wrap it up. We've gone on a good long time. And you all can, if you ever have any questions, or if you want to just talk over the phone, or have a private FaceTime to delve into any parts of this, I've obviously got my foot up, so I got plenty of time. And needless to say, I love these discussions. So, so please stay in touch, and I'll see you next week when we look at the Gilded Age.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter.
That was
Thank-
great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
There you go now. There you go.
Thank you, Peter.
You
Thank
bet.
Bye.